convict, convict,
conviction, conviction, homage, homage,
homage, homage,
fuzzy, fuzzy, duty, duty, symmetry, symmetry, withhold, withhold, agony, agony, livelihood, livelihood, contemptuous, contemptuous, contempt, contempt, contemptible, contemptible, obvious, obvious, obviously, obviously, passive, passive, passively, passively, actively, actively, irrigate, irrigate, irrigation, irrigation, worship, worship, timid, timid, timidity, timidity,
wicked, wicked,
subtle, subtle, subtlety, subtlety, triumph, triumph, triumphant, triumphant, triumphantly, triumphantly,
rain, rain,
sermon, sermon, demonstrate, demonstrate, demonstration, demonstration, fatigue, fatigue, communism, communism, communist, communist, community, community, pertinent, pertinent, abandon, abandon, insight, insight, inherent, inherent, indulge, indulge, indulgent, indulgent, incurable, incurable, inborn, inborn, inalienable, inalienable, infancy, infancy, infant, infant, interrogate, interrogate, interrogation, interrogation, competition, competition, compete, compete, competence, competence, competent, competent, competitive, competitive, competitively, competitively,
an escaped convict, an escaped convict, ex-convict, ex-convict, a convicted murderer, a convicted murderer, a convicted prisoner, a convicted prisoner, a person convicted of sin, a person convicted of sin, death row convict, death row convict, a long-term convict, a long-term convict, a convict settlement, a convict settlement, a firm conviction, a firm conviction, strong moral convictions, strong moral convictions, a summary conviction, a summary conviction, the conviction of sin, the conviction of sin, under conviction, under conviction, hold a conviction, hold a conviction, a man of conviction, a man of conviction, voice one's conviction, voice one's conviction, carry conviction, carry conviction, liege homage, liege homage, vassal homage, vassal homage, vassal fide, vassal fide, pay homage, pay homage, do homage, do homage, a fuzzy image, a fuzzy image, fuzzy outline, fuzzy outline, fuzzy sounds, fuzzy sounds, fuzzy hair, fuzzy hair, a fuzzy photograph, a fuzzy photograph, fuzzy ideas, fuzzy ideas, fuzzy thinking, fuzzy thinking, duty free, duty free, jury duty, jury duty, customs duties, customs duties, import duties, import duties, duty on wine and beer, duty on wine and beer, do one's duty, do one's duty, perform one's duty, perform one's duty, a sense of duty, a sense of duty, the duties of a soldier, the duties of a soldier, military duty, military duty, hours of duty, hours of duty, day duty, day duty, night duty, night duty, one's post of duty, one's post of duty, ministerial duty, ministerial duty, succession duties, succession duties, withhold a name, withhold a name, withhold one's payment, withhold one's payment, withhold one's anger, withhold one's anger, withhold one's favor, withhold one's favor,
Withhold shore leave. Withhold shore leave. Withhold fluids. Withhold fluids. Withhold benefits. Withhold benefits. Withhold evidence. Withhold evidence. Agony aunt. Agony aunt. Agony uncle. Agony uncle. Agony column. Agony column. Agony of mind. Agony of mind. In an agony of joy. In an agony of joy. Mortal agony. Mortal agony. Death agony. Death agony. Spiritual agony. Spiritual agony. Pile up the agony. Pile up the agony. Pile on the agony. Pile on the agony. Lose one's livelihood. Lose one's livelihood. Work for a livelihood. Work for a livelihood. Write for a livelihood. Write for a livelihood. A contemptuous air. A contemptuous air. A contemptuous look. A contemptuous look. Contemptuous defiance. Contemptuous defiance. Contemptuous disregard. Contemptuous disregard. A contemptuous smile. A contemptuous smile. A disdainful smile. A disdainful smile. A contemptuous indifference. A contemptuous indifference. Self-contempt. Self-contempt. Below contempt. Below contempt. Lofty contempt. Lofty contempt. Lofty disdain. Lofty disdain. An object of contempt. An object of contempt. Hold a person in contempt. Hold a person in contempt. Have a person in contempt. Have a person in contempt. Show contempt. show contempt, fall into contempt, fall into contempt, live in contempt, live in contempt, contempt of court, contempt of court, a word of contempt, a word of contempt, contemptible behavior, contemptible behavior, a vulgar fellow, a vulgar fellow, a contemptible fellow, a contemptible fellow, a contemptible wretch, a contemptible wretch, glaringly obvious, glaringly obvious, transparently obvious, transparently obvious, an obvious drawback, an obvious drawback, an obvious meaning, an obvious meaning, an obvious lie, an obvious lie, an obvious love story, an obvious love story, obviously true, obviously true, become passive, become passive, passive smoking, passive smoking, passive resistance, passive resistance, passive tactics, passive tactics, the passive voice, the passive voice, passive obedience, passive obedience, passive bonds, passive bonds, passive debt, passive debt, a passive balloon, a passive balloon, a passive flight, a passive flight, passive congestion, passive congestion, act passively, act passively, actively engaged, actively engaged,
campaign actively, campaign actively, participate actively, participate actively, actively ferment, actively ferment, irrigate the fields, irrigate the fields, irrigate a paddy, irrigate a paddy, irrigate the desert, irrigate the desert, irrigated land, irrigated land, water a rice field, water a rice field, irrigate a rice field, irrigate a rice field, irrigate a catheter, irrigate a catheter, an irrigation canal, an irrigation canal, canal irrigation, canal irrigation, sewage irrigation, sewage irrigation, an irrigation canal, an irrigation canal, an irrigation ditch, an irrigation ditch, irrigation piping, irrigation piping, expand irrigation facilities, expand irrigation facilities, black irrigation systems, black irrigation systems, irrigation rights, irrigation rights, an irrigation project, an irrigation project, irrigation and reclamation projects, irrigation and reclamation projects, hero worship, hero worship, an act of worship, an act of worship, ancestor worship, ancestor worship, morning worship, morning worship, the worship of wealth, the worship of wealth, an object of worship, an object of worship, a house of worship, a house of worship, a place of worship, a place of worship, worship money, worship money, worship an idol, worship an idol, idol worship, idol worship, a timid voice, a timid voice, a timid person, a timid person, a timid manner, a timid manner, timid as a hare, timid as a hare, a timid animal, a timid animal, feel timid, feel timid, nervous timidity, nervous timidity, shy timidity, shy timidity, without timidity, without timidity, a wicked deed, a wicked deed, a wicked person, a wicked person, a wicked horse, a wicked horse, a wicked grin, a wicked grin, punish the wicked, punish the wicked,
a wicked-looking knife, a wicked-looking knife, a wicked storm, a wicked storm, a subtle plan, a subtle plan, subtle fragrance, subtle fragrance, subtle perfume, subtle perfume, subtle colors, subtle colors, A subtle difference. A subtle difference. Subtle irony. Subtle irony. A subtle delight. A subtle delight. A subtle pleasure. A subtle pleasure. A subtle smile. A subtle smile. A subtle enemy. A subtle enemy. Subtle insight. Subtle insight. A subtle observer. A subtle observer. Subtle air. Subtle air. Subtle tact. Subtle tact. A subtle ruse. A subtle ruse. Scholastic subtlety. Scholastic subtlety. The subtleties of language. The subtleties of language. A shout of triumph. A shout of triumph. The triumph of good over evil. The triumph of good over evil. The triumph of right over might. The triumph of right over might. Achieve great triumphs. Achieve great triumphs. With ill-dissembled triumph. With ill-dissembled triumph. In triumph. In triumph. Triumph over an enemy. Triumph over an enemy. Triumph over the fallen enemy. Triumph over the fallen enemy. Triumph over a disease. Triumph over a disease. Triumph over adversity. Triumph over adversity. A triumphant smile. A triumphant smile. A triumphant air. A triumphant air. Triumphant generals. Triumphant generals. A triumphant shout. A triumphant shout. Cry triumphantly. Cry triumphantly. Reign of terror. Reign of terror. Reign supreme. Reign supreme. The reigning monarch. The reigning monarch. The reigning champion. The reigning champion. In the reign of John. In the reign of John. Reign over a vast domain. Reign over a vast domain. Reign over people. Reign over people. Solidify one's reign. Solidify one's reign. Hear a sermon. Hear a sermon. Listen a sermon. Listen a sermon.
Treat a person to a sermon. Treat a person to a sermon. A lace sermon. A lace sermon. Deliver a sermon. Deliver a sermon. Preach a sermon. Preach a sermon. A marathon sermon. A marathon sermon. A condemned sermon. A condemned sermon. Demonstrate one's mobility. Demonstrate one's mobility. Demonstrate the superiority. Demonstrate the superiority. Demonstrate one's flexibility. Demonstrate one's flexibility. Demonstrate a theory. Demonstrate a theory. Demonstrate against the government. Demonstrate against the government. Demonstrate ardor. Demonstrate ardor. Well, a demonstration. Well, a demonstration. An orderly demonstration. An orderly demonstration. A practical demonstration. A practical demonstration. Mass demonstration. Mass demonstration. Hold an all-night demonstration. Hold an all-night demonstration. Join a demonstration. Join a demonstration. Armed demonstration. Armed demonstration. A demonstration model. A demonstration model. A demonstration of grief. A demonstration of grief. Each by demonstration. Each by demonstration. Direct demonstration. Direct demonstration. Metal fatigue. Metal fatigue. Combat fatigue. Combat fatigue. Relieve fatigue. Relieve fatigue. Physical and mental fatigue. Physical and mental fatigue. Signs of fatigue. Signs of fatigue. Drop with fatigue. Drop with fatigue. Propagate communism. Propagate communism. The death of communism. The death of communism. Infiltration of communism. Infiltration of communism. Capitalism versus communism. Capitalism versus communism. Liquidate communism. Liquidate communism. Be infected with communism. Be infected with communism. Anti-communism. Anti-communism. Go communist. Go communist. A hardline communist. A hardline communist. Communist Party. Communist Party. Communist ideology. Communist ideology. A communist country. A communist country. A communist government. A communist government. Community order. Community order. The local community. The local community. The international community. The international community. Serve the community. Serve the community. A community library. A community library. A mercantile community. A mercantile community. A special community. A special community. Village community. Village community. Community spirit. Community spirit. Community of property. Community of property.
Community of interests. Community of interests. Community of race. Community of race. Community of religion. Community of religion. Community solidarity. Community solidarity. Pertinent details. Pertinent details. A pertinent remark. A pertinent remark. A pertinent question. A pertinent question. Make a pertinent remark. Make a pertinent remark. A pertinent suggestion. A pertinent suggestion. Abandon one's plan. Abandon one's plan. Abandon one's friend. Abandon one's friend. Leave one's country. Leave one's country. Abandon one's country. Abandon one's country. Give up hope. Give up hope. Abandon hope. Abandon hope. Keen insight. Keen insight. Deep insight. Deep insight. A writer of great insight. A writer of great insight. Have considerable insight. Have considerable insight. Inherent rights. Inherent rights. An inherent property of matter. An inherent property of matter. One's inherent modesty. One's inherent modesty. An inherent contradiction. An inherent contradiction. Inherent character. Inherent character. Indulge in pleasure. Indulge in pleasure. Indulge in self-pity. Indulge in self-pity. Indulge one's desires. Indulge one's desires. Indulge in drinking. Indulge in drinking. Indulge in sports. Indulge in sports. Indulge in puns. Indulge in puns. Indulge in a holiday. Indulge in a holiday. Indulge in romantic thoughts. Indulge in romantic thoughts. Self-indulgent. Self-indulgent. An indulgent smile. An indulgent smile. Indulgent parents. Indulgent parents. Indulgent treatment. Indulgent treatment. Indulgent with women. Indulgent with women. An incurable disease. An incurable disease. An incurable habit. An incurable habit. An inborn talent. An inborn talent. Inborn traits. Inborn traits. Inborn instinct. Inborn instinct. Inalienable rights. Inalienable rights. To die in infancy. To die in infancy. In infancy. In infancy. In one's infancy. In one's infancy. The infancy of a nation. The infancy of a nation. An infant school. An infant school. Infant teachers. Infant teachers. Infant diseases. Infant diseases. Infant food. Infant food. Infant civilization. Infant civilization. Infant industries. Infant industries. Interrogate a witness. Interrogate a witness. The right to interrogate. The right to interrogate. Interrogate a suspect. Interrogate a suspect. Question a suspect. Question a suspect.
Interrogation mark. Interrogation mark. Ask in a tone of interrogation. Ask in a tone of interrogation. A police interrogation. A police interrogation. Quit an interrogation. Quit an interrogation. In reply to an interrogation. In reply to an interrogation. A diving competition. A diving competition. A gymnastics competition. A gymnastics competition. A competition between nations. A competition between nations. In competition. In competition. Enter a competition. Enter a competition. When competition. When competition. Compete one-on-one. Compete one-on-one. Compete to survive. Compete to survive. Compete in the marathon. Compete in the marathon. Compete in price. Compete in price. Compete for power. Compete for power. Communicative competence. Communicative competence. Professional competence. Professional competence. Exceed one's competence. Exceed one's competence. Acquire a competence. Acquire a competence. Acquire competence. Acquire competence. Have a modest competence. Have a modest competence. Competent detective. Competent detective. A competent teacher. A competent teacher. A competent income. A competent income. The competent authorities. The competent authorities. The competent court. The competent court. The competent minister. The competent minister. Be very competitive. Be very competitive. Be more competitive. Be more competitive. A competitive examination. A competitive examination. Competitive games. Competitive games. Competitive sports. Competitive sports. A competitive price. A competitive price. Fiercely competitive. Fiercely competitive. Be highly competitive. Be highly competitive. Competitive spirit. Competitive spirit. Competitively priced goods. Competitively priced goods.
Bilateral symmetry. Bilateral symmetry. An axis of symmetry. An axis of symmetry. The beauties of symmetry. The beauties of symmetry. With symmetry. With symmetry.